Hello, Internet. I am Pastor Recoil, and welcome to my parish. Today is the 19th Sunday after Pentecost, and we're going to talk about it. Welcome to Pastor Recoil's Parish, where I talk about some things that you may not have heard about in church, either because they're not quite appropriate for all audiences, or it just isn't something that's easy to talk about in a sermon. The readings for the 19th Sunday after Pentecost are Exodus 20, 1 through 7, 7 through 9, and 12 through 20, Psalm 19, Philippians 3, 4b through 14, and Matthew 21, 33 through 46. We're talking about a vineyard and being very careful. See, there is a long-standing tendency in Christianity to assume that the people of God formed by and in Jesus of Nazareth has replaced or superseded the people of God formed in Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and through the covenant made with Moses. I've talked about this tendency before, which is called supersessionism, and I'm bringing it up again both because it is such a problem within Christianity and also because some of the readings today have been used in anti-Semitic and supersessionist ways over the centuries. Today's gospel reading centers itself around a vineyard. And here's what Jesus says. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard. He put a fence around it, dug a wine press in it, and built a tower. For many of us, that's a normal enough start to a parable, but to the folk Jesus is talking to, the chief priests and the elders of the Judean people, they would know exactly what Jesus is talking about. See, in the Hebrew scriptures, there's a passage in the book of the prophet Isaiah, which goes something like this. Let me sing for my loved one a love song for his vineyard. My loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He dug it, cleared away its stones, planted it with excellent vines, built a tower inside it, and dug out a wine vat in it. He expected it to grow good grapes, but it grew rotten grapes. So now you who live in Jerusalem, you people of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I haven't done for it? When I expected it to grow good grapes, why did it grow rotten grapes? Now let me tell you what I'm doing to my vineyard. I'm removing its hedge so it will be destroyed. I'm breaking down its walls so it will be trampled. I'll turn it into a ruin. It won't be pruned or hoed, and thorns and thistles will grow up. I will command the clouds not to rain on it. The vineyard of the Lord of heavenly forces is the house of Israel, and the people of Judah are the plantings in which God delighted. God expected justice, but there was bloodshed. Righteousness, but there was a cry of distress. This passage of Isaiah is a criticism of Jerusalem, not long before its destruction by the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Jerusalem at this time, if the prophets of the Hebrew scriptures are to be taken at their word, was a corrupt mess of rich people abusing their wealth and power to take advantage of the poor. So when Jesus mentions a vineyard, there is this very obvious reference to Israel being a vineyard, both from Isaiah 5 and from a couple other places, so that Jesus' hearers will know exactly what he's talking about. But this isn't even Jesus' first parable involving a vineyard. Now, it's getting more and more obvious what he's talking about with each successive parable, and it all starts at the beginning of chapter 20, when Jesus shares the parable of the workers in the vineyard. This one, the parable of the workers, has a landowner hiring folk throughout the day at 6 a.m., 9 a.m., noon, 3 p.m., 5 p.m. And yet, at the end of the day, the landowner pays all of the workers the same. Now, this is the tamest of the three vineyard parables. It's not really directed at the chief priests and the elders of the people. Instead, this is used as an illustration of what it looks like for the last to be first and the first to be last in the kingdom of heaven. But Matthew still puts these three vineyard parables pretty close together, building up to the one from today's gospel. So next, after the confrontation with the chief priests and elders of the people, Jesus offers the parable of the two sons, which I covered last week. I'm not going to rehash that here, but it is another vineyard parable. One where one son says he won't work in his father's vineyard but does, and the other son says he will work in the father's vineyard but doesn't. The Judean leaders are forced to admit that the first son did his father's will rather than the second. And that parable leads directly into today's vineyard reading. So let's continue on from there. When it was time for the harvest, the landowner sent his servants to the tenant farmers to collect his fruit. But the tenant farmers grabbed his servants. They beat some of them, and some of them they killed. Some of them they stoned to death. Again, he sent other servants, more than the first group. They treated them the same way. Finally, he sent his son to them. They will respect my son, he said. But when the tenant farmers saw the son, they said to each other, "This is the heir. Come on, let's kill him, and then we'll have his inheritance." So they grabbed him, threw him out of the vineyard, and killed him. When the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenant farmers? They said he will totally destroy those wicked farmers and rent the vineyard to other tenant farmers who will give him the fruit when it's ready. But Jesus said to them, "Haven't you ever read in the scriptures, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this, and it's amazing in our eyes. Therefore, I tell you that God's kingdom will be taken away from you and will be given to a people who produce its fruit. Whoever falls on this stone will be crushed, and the stone will crush the person it falls on." Now, when the chief priests and the Pharisees heard this parable, they knew Jesus was talking about them. They were trying to arrest him, but they feared the crowds who thought he was a prophet. Now, this is a strong condemnation of the Judean leaders, one that they absolutely understood. It's one of Jesus' strongest takes against the folk who will eventually petition Pontius Pilate to effect his execution. Unfortunately, this condemnation against the leaders of the Judean people in the 1st century CE is often read in a supersessionist way as a condemnation of all the Judean people, which isn't what Jesus is saying here. Remember, Israel is not the tenants of the vineyard, Israel is the vineyard itself. And in the parable, the vineyard isn't going anywhere. Not unlike Isaiah 5, it's not the whole people of God who are condemned, it's the one who are, and this is straight from the text of Isaiah 5, acquiring so much real estate that there is none left for anyone else. It kind of sounds like ancient Israel isn't all that different from today. Now, this isn't to say that the leaders of the Judean people are doing exactly that action, but the idea is that they are not doing the will of God, which is especially true when you put these parables all together. And so God is going to remove them and put a new group in who will. And that's exactly the reason why we need to be careful. Those leaders are not necessarily Christians, and also it's a parable. It's explicitly not meant to be taken literally. As Christians, we love to read into the parable that Jesus is painting himself as the son of the vineyard's owner who was put to death by the tenants, but he's not necessarily doing that. While it does fit neatly into a Trinitarian reading, as well as it fits into the Gospel of Matthew's author's own biases against the leaders of the Judean people, that connection isn't actually as explicit as many Christians would like it to be. Instead, I think we're supposed to be encouraged by this text to bring a certain humility both to the text and the ways that we live our lives. This is something Paul addresses head on in Romans 11, that Gentile Christians are grafted onto an Israelite tree. Non-Judean Christians are guests in a house that belongs to someone else. And so therefore we should act like it and not assume that we live there. To put it more crudely, we oughtn't pee on someone else's rugs, especially if the rug really ties the room together. Now, even though it isn't Paul's strongest statement on living and acting with humility, this trend is still very present in Philippians chapter 3. This chapter comes on the heels of last week's section on Philippians 2, where Paul more explicitly calls Christians to live with a humility like Christ's. But Paul also points out something really important, that it's not our accomplishments that we should put our confidence in, it's Christ, the one who gathered us in and grafted us onto that tree. Here's what Paul has to say. If anyone else has reason to put their confidence in physical advantages, I have even more. I was circumcised on the 8th day. I am from the people of Israel in the tribe of Benjamin. I am a Hebrew of Hebrews. With respect to observing the law, I'm a Pharisee. With respect to devotion to the faith, I harass the church. With respect to righteousness under the law, I'm blameless. These things were my assets, but I wrote them off as a loss for the sake of Christ. Even beyond that, I consider everything a loss in comparison with the superior value of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. I have lost everything for him, but what I lost I think of as dog shit, that I might gain Christ and be found in him. I may have edited one of the words there to make it more accurate to the Greek, since apparently delicate Christian ears are incapable of hearing certain words, even if they're the words that are actually in the Bible. But here's really the point. Knowing Jesus is supposed to be the most important thing. And knowing Jesus Christ is knowing the one who showed love to the world and loving the world in that same way. That requires us to live in humility, not to try to exclude everyone who doesn't fit our narrow categories, especially if they're the Jewish people in whose house we live and whose God we worship. So if you want to see more content like this, check out the links to my right or click the logo below my face to subscribe so you'll know when my next video comes out. Thank you for watching, and take the time this week to love your neighbor as yourself, especially if you don't like them all that much.